The silence beneath the fluorescent lights. 1. The room was small, the air still, sterile. Somewhere in the corner, a tape recorder clicked. It was 1993, and Jeffrey Dahmer, the man the world called the Milwaukee Monster, was sitting under the cold glow of a prison light, calmly describing the unthinkable. His voice was quiet, almost polite, but what he spoke about, what he remembered, would freeze the blood of even the most seasoned investigator. These were not his usual confessions. These were the lost interviews, fragments of conversation that never aired, recorded by an investigative journalist just months before Dahmer's death. The tapes, according to official records, were misplaced during a transfer. Yet years later, snippets would resurface, whispered about among criminologists and collectors of true crime rarities. Some say the recordings revealed things that the public was never meant to hear. According to the few who listened, Dahmer spoke not only about his crimes, but about something else, something that haunted him long before the killings began. "I felt it watching me," he allegedly said. "They think I hunted men. Maybe, but I was hunted too." This opening line became a mystery in itself, a psychological puzzle lost to time. What did Dahmer mean? What had he seen in those silent hours between death and desire? The lost interviews promised not just a glimpse into the mind of a killer, but a descent into a darkness that even Dahmer himself could not fully explain. The early shadows, the boy who dissected silence. According to official records, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born in Milwaukee in 1960, the first son of Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. Neighbors recalled a quiet child, polite, withdrawn, almost painfully shy. But silence in his case was not innocence. It was the sound of something forming, an invisible fracture in the soul of a boy who watched the world through glassy eyes. By the age of 4, Jeffrey's fascination with death had already begun. His father, a research chemist, once showed him how to dissolve animal bones in acid, a simple scientific demonstration. But for Jeffrey, it was a revelation. The moment the bones disappeared into the bubbling liquid, something inside him awoke. "It was like magic," he would later say, "and I wanted to see more." In high school, Dahmer became the ghost of the classroom, drifting between invisibility and sudden, bizarre acts of humor. He mocked the teachers, pretended seizures, imitated disabilities. His classmates laughed. They called it doing a Dahmer. But no one noticed the growing void inside him. No one saw the bottles of alcohol hidden in his locker. No one knew that every night he walked the woods searching for roadkill to dissect, alone under the distant hum of streetlights. According to later psychiatric evaluations, Dahmer's teenage years revealed an early dissociation from empathy, a term too clean to describe what was really happening. His mother's mental illness and his parents' constant fighting turned the house into a battlefield of anxiety and medication. When Joyce finally left, taking Jeffrey's younger brother and leaving him behind, Dahmer's world collapsed into silence once again. It was in that silence that he made his first kill. June 1978, a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. The official report says they met by chance, shared a few beers, and talked. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer struck him with a dumbbell. Later, he would tell police, "I didn't want him to go." Those 5 words became the first thread in a tapestry of horror woven over the next 13 years. But what investigators never understood, what the lost interviews suggested, was that Dahmer remembered that moment differently. "It wasn't rage," he said. "It was loneliness. Like I was holding onto a shadow that wanted to disappear." Forensic psychologists often call it the threshold moment, the point where thought becomes action. For Dahmer, it was less a choice and more a surrender. The boy who once stared into jars of animal bones had finally found a new kind of specimen, human, fragile, and impossibly alive. The apartment on 25th Street, the birth of a monster. According to police reports, it was 1990 when Jeffrey Dahmer signed the lease for apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street in Milwaukee. To the landlord, he seemed like a quiet tenant, polite, punctual with rent, unremarkable. But behind the beige walls of that small one-bedroom apartment, the world would soon come to know the meaning of horror. Neighbors complained of strange smells, rotting meat, formaldehyde, something foul that clung to the hallways. Dahmer told them it was spoiled pork, an accident with tropical fish. He smiled and nodded, and they believed him. No one wanted to imagine that just a few feet away, inside that apartment, a man was dissecting the remains of his victims, preserving skulls, and photographing their lifeless bodies in poses of stillness and control. The lost interviews revealed Dahmer's chilling self-awareness during this period. "I built a shrine," he confessed, voice calm, eyes steady. "I wanted them to stay, to never leave again." The interviewer asked him what staying meant. Dahmer paused, then said, "Being mine." Forensic photographs later showed the extent of that obsession. Human skulls lined on a cabinet, torsos stored in acid-filled drums, and a freezer containing hearts and biceps. But the photos captured only the aftermath. The true horror lived in Dahmer's meticulous rituals, the Polaroid camera always at hand, the bleach, the drills, the dismemberment followed by silence and television static. According to one surviving transcript, Dahmer claimed that during his killings, he sometimes heard something whisper. It wasn't voices of conscience, nor hallucinations. It was, as he described, the hum of the refrigerator, like it was breathing. Some investigators dismissed it as madness. Others saw it as a metaphor, the mechanical life of the apartment itself, becoming complicit in his crimes. The building's residents would later recall the sound of the buzzsaw at night, the dull rhythm of chopping mixed with the low thump of music from Dahmer's stereo. "Sometimes I thought he was building furniture," one neighbor said. "He was polite. You don't think monsters say hello." When police finally entered apartment 213 on July 22, 1991, they discovered what one detective called a museum of death. 84 photographs, 7 skulls, 3 torsos, countless fragments of bone. And yet, what they didn't find was perhaps more disturbing. Several items noted in early reports were never recovered. A box labeled samples, a cassette tape from his personal interviews, and a written note described as confessional. These would later vanish from the evidence room entirely. In the lost interviews, Dahmer was asked what he feared the most. His answer was barely a whisper, not dying, but being forgotten. Inside his mind, the science of control and the search for God. According to psychiatric reports, Jeffrey Dahmer was both lucid and detached, a paradox wrapped in surgical precision. He wasn't driven by rage or revenge, but by something colder, the desire to possess, to control. In one of the lost interviews, Dahmer described his killings not as acts of violence, but as experiments in permanence. He explained almost clinically how he sought to create living zombies, men without will or memory, kept in a half-alive state through crude lobotomies and acid injections. His words were disturbingly calm, as though he were describing an experiment rather than an atrocity. "I didn't want to hurt them," he said. "I just wanted them to stay." To understand Dahmer is to confront the unbearable question: how does a man separate empathy from existence? Experts from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit later noted that Dahmer's pathology combined necrophilia, cannibalism, and obsessive-compulsive disorder in an unprecedented psychological triad. But even they admitted there was something unclassifiable about him, a void that resisted definition. Dahmer's father, Lionel, would later describe visiting his son in prison as staring into the reflection of guilt. He still believed Jeffrey's evil had a scientific root: chemical imbalance, childhood trauma, the influence of pornography. But Jeffrey spoke differently. "It wasn't chemicals," he said in one recording. "It was something spiritual, like a hunger that couldn't be fed." The interviewer asked what he meant by spiritual. Dahmer's answer was haunting. "When I looked into their eyes, I felt close to something divine, like I was touching creation itself. But it was inverted. It was God through decay." In the months leading up to his death, Dahmer began reading the Bible obsessively. He was baptized in prison, reportedly by a local minister who believed in redemption through faith. Some said Dahmer cried after the ceremony. Others said he smiled. In one lost interview, however, he left a cryptic remark: "You can wash the body, but not the mind." Psychologists who analyzed his final interviews disagreed on whether this transformation was genuine. Was it repentance or manipulation? Fear or revelation? According to one unverified transcript, Dahmer spoke of seeing faces in the dark, not the faces of his victims, but of something else, something he claimed wanted to be remembered. Even now, those words linger like an echo through the corridors of human understanding. Was Dahmer merely confessing, or was he documenting the final stages of a mind unraveling, a man trying to decode his own damnation? Whatever the answer, one thing remains clear: the line between science and faith, sanity and madness, was never thinner than in the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer. The discovery, when the walls finally spoke, July 22nd, 1991. A night the quiet of apartment 213 shattered into history. According to the Milwaukee Police Department's report, it began with a single survivor, Tracy Edwards, 32, who fled Dahmer's apartment wearing a steel handcuff on his wrist. He told officers about a weird guy with knives and pictures. What followed would become one of the most horrifying discoveries in American criminal history. When officers Rolf Mueller and Robert Routh entered the apartment, they noticed the odor first, a sweet, rotten stench that clung to everything. In the bedroom, a drawer revealed Polaroid photos, dozens of them, showing the process of murder and dismemberment. Each body meticulously arranged, each photograph an unholy attempt to preserve beauty after death. "These are for real," Mueller said. His partner nodded silently. The nightmare had been photographed frame by frame. Then came the refrigerator. Inside, the head of a man. Below it, a box containing a human heart. In the corner stood a 57-gallon drum filled with decomposing torsos. Reporters would later describe the scene as a slaughterhouse disguised as an apartment, but those who were there spoke of something else, a strange calm. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the screams, leaving behind only the echo of routine. During one of the lost interviews, Dahmer was asked how he felt as police uncovered his secret world. He replied, "Relieved. It was over. I was tired of being haunted by what I created." When pressed to explain what haunted him, he said only, "The silence." The apartment was sealed within hours, swarmed by forensics, journalists, and detectives. But among the evidence collected, several items listed on early inventory sheets vanished soon after, including 2 cassette tapes marked Audio 1 and Audio 2, described as self-recorded confessions. These tapes were never presented in court. They were never found again. Years later, retired detective Patrick Kennedy claimed in an interview that he had heard one of those tapes. "It wasn't what you'd expect," he said. He wasn't bragging. He was explaining, like he thought someone was asking him questions that weren't there. Kennedy paused before adding, "And then, right near the end, you can hear another voice, faint, mechanical, almost whispering his name." Some dismissed it as interference, tape degradation, or a hoax. Others weren't so sure. The legend of the lost interviews grew from that mystery, not because of what Dahmer said, but because of what was heard beneath his voice. In the aftermath of the arrest, the Oxford Apartments became a pilgrimage site for the morbidly curious. People gathered outside, staring up at the sealed windows, imagining what horrors lay within. In 1992, the building was demolished. Yet, according to residents in the area, the odor, that same faint, metallic sweetness, lingered long after the rubble was cleared. Even now, those who lived on North 25th Street claim that on hot summer nights, the air still carries a trace of it, as if the walls are still breathing, still remembering what the world tried to forget. The trial. Voices from the abyss. According to official transcripts, the trial of Jeffrey Dahmer began on January 30th, 1992, in Milwaukee County Circuit Court. It lasted only 2 weeks, but it echoed through the conscience of America for decades. Seated behind bulletproof glass, Dahmer appeared calm, almost bored. He pleaded guilty, but insane, to 15 counts of murder. Observers described his demeanor as eerie detachment. He listened to each charge read aloud with no visible reaction, hands folded neatly in his lap. Occasionally, he nodded, as if correcting a student's recitation of facts. The prosecutor called him the most methodical killer in modern history. The defense called him a broken man. Both were right. The courtroom became a theater of unbearable emotion. The families of victims faced him, trembling, furious, shattered. Some screamed at him, others wept in silence. One father shouted, "You are the devil." Dahmer looked up and replied softly, "I understand how you feel," according to court psychologists. Dahmer's emotional neutrality was a result of deep depersonalization, a chronic detachment from reality that rendered guilt abstract and remorse performative. But in one of the lost interviews, recorded just days after sentencing, Dahmer's voice cracked for the first time. "I killed them all. I know that. But I was trying to find something good, and I never did." The prosecution presented over 160 pieces of evidence, including the infamous Polaroid photos, fragments of bone, skulls, and tools of mutilation. But what truly unsettled the jury were the notebooks, Dahmer's handwritten records of experiments, temperature notes, even sketches of body positioning. Among those papers, one page stood out, a list titled "The Ideal." It described a man without fear, without will, without leaving. Some lines were underlined twice, as though etched in longing rather than madness. When Dahmer finally spoke to the court, his statement was brief and haunting. "I know my time is short. I have done evil beyond repair. I know I deserve death. But I don't believe I can die yet. There's still something waiting." Those last words unsettled even the presiding judge, Lawrence Graham Jr., who later admitted he had never felt such coldness fill a room. Reporters in the gallery wrote that the air seemed to shift, as though the courtroom itself exhaled a breath it didn't know it was holding. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, 957 years in prison. Let many notice the curious absence of several exhibits that were supposed to be presented during the trial. The missing audio tapes, a confiscated journal, and a box of undeveloped film. According to the district clerk, they had been misfiled during transfer. They were never seen again. And yet, in one of the final lost interviews, Dahmer hinted that he knew where they went. "They took what I couldn't burn," he said, smiling faintly. When the interviewer asked who they were, Dahmer didn't answer. He just stared into the recorder's red light and whispered, "Listen long enough, and you'll hear them too." To this day, some claim that during the playback of that tape, a low hum, identical to the one described in earlier confessions, could be heard beneath his voice. The final days, redemption or reckoning. In prison, Jeffrey Dahmer lived in quiet segregation at first. According to the Columbia Correctional Institution's internal records, he was placed in solitary confinement for his own protection. But isolation never frightened him. "It's peaceful," he once said in an interview, "like being inside your own head forever." Over time, Dahmer was integrated into the general population. He worked in the prison kitchen, cleaned bathrooms, read the Bible, and kept mostly to himself. But according to other inmates, he had developed a dark, mocking humor. He shaped his food into severed limbs, covered it in ketchup, and offered it to guards with a smile. One guard later said he wanted to be remembered as the monster they said he was. And yet, there were contradictions. Prison chaplain Roy Ratcliffe, who baptized Dahmer in May 1994, described him as a man deeply haunted but earnestly searching for forgiveness. He claimed that Dahmer read scripture daily and often spoke about the possibility of redemption. "He didn't cry," Ratcliffe recalled, "but he trembled when he prayed." In the lost interviews, Dahmer reflected on those final months with an eerie calm. "I think God let me live long enough to see what I'd done," he said. That's the real punishment, memory. He described recurring nightmares in which his victims stood at the edge of a lake, silent, their reflections rippling in water that smelled like bleach. Fellow inmates later testified that Dahmer had grown increasingly withdrawn. He stopped joking. He stopped drawing. He started giving away his possessions, books, magazines, even his Bible. To one inmate, he allegedly said, "I won't be here much longer. They're coming for me." On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to a work detail with two other prisoners, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. The three men were sent to clean the prison gymnasium. Within 20 minutes, guards found Dahmer lying face down in a pool of blood, his skull crushed with a metal bar from a weight machine. He was pronounced dead at 9:11 a.m. According to official reports, Scarver later claimed that God told him to do it. He said Dahmer laughed at him moments before the attack. "He didn't scream," Scarver said. "He just looked at me, like he was expecting it." The coroner's report listed blunt force trauma as the cause of death, but certain details remain unexplained. The absence of surveillance footage, a missing page from the guard's logbook, and the fact that Dahmer's cell, searched later that day, contained a handwritten note that read, "I forgave me." But he didn't. Some believe Dahmer orchestrated his own death, a final act of control disguised as fate. Others insist it was divine justice, the inevitable conclusion to a life built on desecration. But those who studied the lost interviews point to something deeper. In his final recorded conversation, Dahmer spoke almost in riddles. There's a difference between death and silence. Death ends things. Silence, that keeps them alive. Even now, that final line remains one of the most disturbing in true crime history. Because when the tape ends and the hum fades, one can almost hear it, a faint echo, a breath, as if something or someone never truly left. The legacy of the lost interviews, what still echoes today. According to official archives, the case of Jeffrey Dahmer was closed on February 17, 1995, 3 months after his death. But for criminologists, journalists, and the families of his victims, it never truly ended. Every few years, new fragments surface. A photograph mislabeled in evidence, a page from a lost journal, or a rumor of a tape that should not exist. These fragments, like ghosts, keep the story alive, or perhaps keep it from resting. The so-called lost interviews have become an obsession in true crime circles. Some claim they hold deeper psychological insight into Dahmer's motives. Others insist they reveal something far stranger, an element of paranoia, prophecy, or even possession. Audio engineers who examined recovered snippets reported irregular frequencies, distortions, whispers, and low hums that do not correspond to environmental noise. One researcher described it as a resonance, as though the voice were layered over itself. To skeptics, this is nothing but analog decay. To others, it's proof that Dahmer's voice, and whatever haunted him, still lingers between frequencies. The idea that his story might still speak unsettles both science and faith alike. In 2021, a private collector from Ohio claimed to possess one of the original cassettes labeled Interview 2. He provided a short audio sample to a journalist, 15 seconds of indistinct murmuring and static, ending with Dahmer's unmistakable voice saying, "Do you still hear it?" The file was analyzed by multiple experts, all of whom confirmed it was genuine. Days later, the collector vanished. His house was found empty. The tape, gone. According to official police statements, no criminal investigation was opened. The disappearance was ruled voluntary. But the timing, just days after his claim, reignited speculation that the lost interviews are part of something larger, something deliberately buried. Dahmer himself once said, "Some truths aren't supposed to be told. They live better in silence." For those who've studied the case, the true horror of Jeffrey Dahmer isn't only what he did, but what he represented, a mirror held to humanity's darkest curiosity. Why do we keep listening to him? Why do we return to the voice of a man who turned loneliness into ritual and ritual into death? Perhaps because, as one criminologist said, when we listen to Dahmer, we're not looking for him. We're looking for the part of ourselves that recognizes him. The Oxford apartments are gone now, replaced by a vacant lot, surrounded by trees that grow a little too fast, their roots thick and tangled in the earth. Locals say nothing grows straight there. Some nights, people passing by swear they hear the faint hum of a refrigerator, rhythmic, almost breathing. According to the final note found in the lost interviews, Dahmer ended his last conversation with a whisper. It's never really over. You just stop hearing it. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer. Not the bodies, not the evidence, not even the trial, but the silence that follows his words. A silence so deep that, if you listen long enough, you might begin to understand why some stories were never meant to be found.